assessments particularly, I would encourage you to use those sites. Now, the person's brain is going to be an important source of information for you, because their brain is not going to function in the way that yours and mine does. It will have some limitations to it because of the disease process, and those limitations will be unique to each person. We know, if we just have a look through the lobes of the brain here, the different ways that people with dementia will utilise their brain to function and some of the unique problems associated with each of these areas. The frontal lobe, for instance, in blue, we see here at the front. This frontal lobe area is going to help us to be able to make decisions about where we want to go. So cognitive ability to make decisions will be an important part of the person's day, particularly when they come to moments of transition. They go from their room into the public space of the corridor or the dining space or the activity space. They make a decision. I have to go this way, or I have to go that way. How they make that decision will be dependent on their capacity here, their area that supports decision making. So the decision needs to be fairly simple and straightforward. What other ways can you think of that the frontal lobes of the person's brain might be influencing their ability to move around or to take up their physical environment? What other ways do you think a frontal lobe might be influencing that? Think about what the frontal lobes do. We talked about them the other day. Decision making, planning, sequencing, doing one thing after the other.
When to start, when to stop.
When to start, when to stop. Good. So your physical environment needs to be simple. It needs to enable you to make decisions at the right time. So that means you need to have the information available for the person to help them make a simple decision. So we need visual cues to help the person to make the decisions in as simple a way as possible. Visual cues. And one of the simplest cues that you can provide is a locating object. Now, it might be a piece of sculpture, it might be a pot plant, it might be a chair, it might be a painting. An object situated so that the person can associate that object with where they want to go. So they know when they get to the painting of the boat that that's where I go to turn to my room. And all you need to do is do this repetition several times of taking the person. Once you see the painting of the boat, you go left and there's your room.
Like lines like the hospitals used to have.
That's right. The lines on the floor in the hospital were designed to make it simple for people so that they didn't have to continually ask people where to go. Okay, so that's one way in which your frontal lobes might be useful, or you might need to modify your physical environment for your brain. The parietal lobe. Let's have a look at what the parietal lobe does. The parietal lobe is involved in what we call visuospatial function. Visuospatial function. And that simply means that your parietal lobe helps you to locate yourself in relation to other objects. So if you have problems with visuospatial function, you're going to get lost. Or you might have trouble reading a map. Sometimes we do. So, people with Alzheimer's will often be reported to be getting lost very early on. They'll get disoriented. And that's because Alzheimer's is quite often in the parietal lobe and moves in from the parietal and temporal lobes into the frontal area. So the parietal lobe is an important area for enabling the person to locate themselves, but when it misfunctions or malfunctions, the person is much more likely to get lost. So we need to provide locating cues, similarly to what we do with the frontal lobe. We need to provide locating cues. And that might be in the form of an object, or it might be in form of colours. So it might be painting the toilet door blue.
With the toilet seat sometimes they're all the same colour.
Right. So what we need is visual contrast to enable the person to identify the toilet seat so they can pee within the toilet seat, or on the toilet seat, within the toilet. Does that make sense?
Mm.
Contrasts are very important there. But actually contrast, we'll look at the occipital lobe, we'll talk about contrasts in a moment. Locating cues. All of this helps the person to find their way. You think about what helps you in the supermarket. What helps you to find your way to where you need to go in the supermarket? Signs.
Yeah.
So the signs are at the end of the aisle, aren't they? Yeah?
And then they're not.
Yeah, when they're not.
They're not.
And supermarkets quite deliberately make it confusing for you so that you have to walk up and down all the aisles. It's a deliberate strategy to expose you to their produce.
They put the milk and the bread right at the end of the supermarket, so you have to walk through.
So you have to walk through everything. Exactly. Yeah. Because otherwise you wouldn't go down near them. So it's a very deliberate strategy. All the things that you need regularly, you have to walk through other things to get to.
Because they can pick up on the way.
What's that?
You can pick up the junk things on the way, which you don't need.
Which you don't need, that's right. Now, why do they have all of those lollies at the checkout?
You're waiting there.
The kids.
Because they are impulsive.
Magazines.
And ice cream
It's
outside,
impulsive.
even outside the counter.
It's at kid level, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the demand of children on their parents when they're standing at the checkout is such a motivator for parents to say no here.
They also have the magazines there so where they start looking
It's
to
magazines. Yeah. So what does this tell us about how we need to arrange the physical environment for people who have cognitive impairment? What should we do?
Make it as easy to use and as accessible as possible.
Make it as easy and accessible as possible.
the opposite from what the supermarket does.
The opposite from what the supermarket does. We're not trying to get them to buy things. We're trying to get them to make it as easy as possible for people to move around. So what we do is we use the reverse of using this principle because they know how the person's brain functions. So should we. Okay. So in terms of making choices, what we want to do is make it simple for people to move around and to find their way. So we don't change things all that easily or readily. Keep things predictable. This is important. But if you do change things, make it easy for the person to get used to the new way of doing things. So you have lots of indicators around, you have people to help, you have advice, etc. Because what's one of the most annoying things about a change in the supermarket? It's when
you're wasting your time, trying to find where you need to go, sort of thing.
That's right. And there's no staff around to help you do it. So what do we need? We need staff around to help people, get information to them so that they can find their way, that sort of thing. Okay. So your parietal lobe is very useful to you in finding your way and working out where you need to go. Because people with the dementia will tend not to remember where they were. But one of the things if they are admitted to an aged care home early enough is that they will start to remember where their room is. And the earlier they get there, in a sense, the better. Often people are admitted to aged care homes a bit too late, where they have lost the ability to adapt to a new care environment, or a new living environment. It makes it very difficult for them. So let's move to the occipital lobe. Right at the back of the brain is where we process what? Vision. Visual function. So lines, shapes, colours, edges, circles. All of these things are processed by separate types of neurons, quite interestingly. There are some neurons in your occipital lobe that just process edges. Bizarre, but it does. Quite amazing what our brain does. But what it does is it puts it all together so we can recognise a shape, an object. And what are the most important objects that people know how to recognise? Faces. Interesting, isn't it? Faces are really important to us. Why are faces important to us? So we can connect to people, particularly the people who love us and the people who are not part of our group. So we need to know who's a friend and who's an enemy. Right? So it's a very primitive ability to recognise faces. What are the faces of the people who I am close to, who are part of my group, and who don't I know? Because then I'll know how to keep alive. Does that make sense? Very primitive ability. So the occipital lobe is the area of our brain that helps us to be able to see around us, to work out what's going on visually. By doing that, we can function, we can use objects. So the objects in our environment need to be objects that we know how to use. How long did it take you to get used to using one of these? You younger ones will say.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, yeah.
Still working on it. Still working for it.
Right. So our ability to learn to use objects needs to be associated with how new or different the object is. But one of the things that happens with dementia is that people will no longer recognise some objects. Now the object might be clothing, or it might be faces of family members, or it might be food, or it might even be furniture.
Or it might be that they don't know the word, but they might say, like for a shirt, they might say, oh, that thing, you know, you put it on, like, so they just can't find the correct word.
That's right. Now that might be a memory problem, but it can also be associated with this object recognition difficulty, which means that they might see it, but actually the brain doesn't understand how to use it. So if that's the case, have you ever seen somebody with dementia try to put a jumper on?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. What are they doing? It's not a visual problem, is it? Because they can see it, but their brain is not recognising what it is or how to use it. So if they're not recognising how to use it, their brain is not understanding the object and the meaning of the object. So that's what's important here. This is not a visual problem. It's a comprehension problem. So they can see the furniture, they can see the face, they can see the shirt, but they don't know what it is or how to use it. And it's actually not a language problem. It's not forgetting the word, it's knowing what it's for. So if they're not recognising that food is to be eaten, then they can end up doing all sorts of things with food that's not appropriate to what the object is. And this might also be the case with faeces, for instance. Not recognising the object for what it is, and hence misusing it. Does that make sense? Okay. So object recognition is a particularly difficult problem in a physical environment. So if somebody has object recognition problems, what do we need to do to the physical environment to enable it to be supportive? That's our question. I'm not expecting you to answer it, but what would come to mind straight away if you did have to answer?
You can't hide it, highlight it.
If you can't hide it, highlight it. Right, okay. Yeah, if it's going to be useful to the person, then we want to highlight it. We also want to simplify it, don't we? Without making the environment impoverished. This is important. It needs to be a rich, personalised environment without necessarily being dangerous for the person. But at the same time, ready to support the person to be able to use it properly. And that's why we set up dressing in such a way that it's a process that the person can be successful at. So they're not coming out looking like Superman, the undies over the top. We want them to be able to get dressed successfully so they can be socially engaged with other people. So our occipital lobes are really important for helping the person to function visually. Think about too the colours of an environment. You mentioned pastels?
Mm.
Yeah. Pastels are generally regarded as being more calming than the primary colours, the bright colours. However, I've been in environments where there have been a lot of colours around that are very bright and people are very much enjoying the environment. So it depends what you do with the colours, I think, that matters, because these colours were in a mural and the mural was of the seaside. Bright blue, bright yellows, you know, some reds, bright colours, but it was meaningful because it was actually not far from here, close to the seaside. So it made sense to people. And what it did was brighten it up. It was a wall, floor-to-ceiling mural along a wall that had been painted by a local artist. And it was a beautiful thing. So how you use colours makes a lot of difference, I think. You can make it as boring as anything by using lots of the same colours or very pale beige or whatever you might call it, or creams and so on. It can be just very boring. But what you flesh that out with is important. So visually, the environment needs to be stimulating enough to be interesting and familiar and yet simple at the same time. So sometimes that's a difficult path to tread. So that's our occipital lobe. Temporal lobe. What's our temporal lobe help us with?
Memory.
Memory. Okay. And memory, as we saw the other day when we were talking about biology, memory was particularly important because it is so complex. We have what's called biographical memory, which is memory for what I've done, my own biography, my life story memory. Then we have what's called working memory, which is the space within our mind where we store things temporarily long enough to be able to use it. So I've got to remember that phone number so that I can phone in a couple of minutes' time. Or I'll remember the code to get in here for the few days that I'm here, because I'm using it several times and I can remember it just long enough. But once I've gone away for a few days, I know I don't have to remember it again till next time. And hope somebody's here who can let me in. Okay, so that's working memory. And then there's long-term memory, which is more about that well-rehearsed memory where we place things in our mind that we know we need again. And so we do store them. And then there's what we might call implicit and explicit memory. Remember we talked about that the other day? Explicit memory is what? What you're doing. Yeah.
But you don't know.
And implicit memory is?
What you know, what
You know.
Things you know that you might not know you know. Yeah. Like how to do things. That's right. Good. Right, so it's implicit and explicit memory. This comes the environment, if we're going to support the temporal lobe function, it needs to be familiar, so that memory is not tasked with strangeness all the time. The temporal lobe needs familiarity. If the person is having memory loss, then they will need to be in a familiar environment. Something that says, this is your place, this is where you belong, you can feel comfortable here. All right. These are some of the social, cognitive and behavioural issues. These are, the neurological problems. What are the social, cognitive and behavioural consequences of these problems? Now, we've seen over the last couple of days that there are quite a few behavioural problems that might emerge because somebody has some language issues or some memory problems or some action problems or failure to recognise objects. They might well become frustrated and become aggressive. Or they might also become lost and disoriented if they can't remember where their room is. Or they might not be able to eat effectively because they don't recognise what the food is, or they can't remember the sequence of how to eat or how to get dressed. So there can be a number of these activities of daily living that can be affected by the way that somebody has their dementia. All right, so there's lots of these consequences.